Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our hand tool SIG. And I thought today we would go back to absolute basics and just talk about taking a kind of old tool that you might find in a garage sale or any kind of sale, the old tool swap meet or whatever. And I thought we'd just go over the basics of sharpening a chisel and what's involved, and that actually will set you up for most your understanding of what you need to get to for a chisel is just the same as what you need for a plain blade or various other blades. So we'll be getting to that very shortly. So that's pretty much what I want to focus on today. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I can actually hear you now because I'm close to my loudspeaker. And I'm going to really try and keep, usually I have 350 props. I'm going to try and keep my props level down because I want to keep it simple. So I'm going to start about first of all, mention a couple of different methods of sharpening and what the advantages and disadvantages of them are. If you're sharpening on a real low budget, you can actually use regular sandpaper, just ordinary, the stuff that you use in your shop anyway. And you use it on glass. You can either glue it to the glass, or you can, if you have a really nice flat piece of glass, you can use a surface tension of water to hold it down. This glass is a little too thin for what you want. You want something that's at least 3/8 of an inch thick. The thicker, the better. Ideally, with its corners knocked off, so you don't end up getting little chips and so on. And it needs to be ideally plate glass. It should be perfectly flat. Plate glass, I think, is set. It's poured onto liquid mercury or mercury at room temperature. It's really nice and flat. Not so easy to get though. You can buy it. Here in the shop we have a piece of granite that does exactly the same thing. We have a perfectly flat piece of granite, but it weighs probably 25 pounds. So I didn't get it out of the shop, out of the closets to do that. So what you do with the sandpaper is you work up through the grits, depending on what you need to start with. If you're flattening something like a plane, the sole of a plane, you probably want to start with 100 or even 80 grit, and you just work your way up through the grits, getting finer and finer grits. And you can take that all the way up to a very high polish. If you go up into 1500 and use a little water, use wet and dry paper, and you can keep your tools really, really nice and sharp just using this method. The big advantage is it's got a low entry level cost because all you got to do is buy glass and sandpaper. However, the sandpaper wears out very quickly. You know how quickly your sandpaper wears out on wood. Imagine how quickly it wears out on a piece of steel. So you're constantly changing the sandpaper, and sandpaper's a buck a sheet. You get what, maybe 3 of these out of it. I'm cheap, so I go to Harbor Freight and I buy belt sanding, sanding belts, which have a really nice cloth back, which improves the usefulness of it. And I glue those down on a nice thick piece of glass when I have to use it. And I do use it, especially for things like flattening a plane sole or a really, really rough blade that needs a lot of work. You can start with that heavy grit. I'm going to start using sandpaper, then I'm going to move on to diamond plates, which I mentioned before. You don't have to use a diamond plate. You can use water stones or even oil stones. I know very little about using oil stones. I know a fair amount. I've used water stones a lot. And the real key to all of these is to have a flat surface. If you're trying to achieve this conjunction of 2 flat surfaces here coming to a real sharp point, you want both surfaces to be flat. Otherwise, you're never going to actually get that sharp edge. You might get part of a sharp edge, but if there's any curve to it, then you're not going to quite get there. And there's a couple of tricks we can do to overcome little minor things like that. So really key is having this flat surface, whether it's a waterstone, such as this, or a diamond plate, or sandpaper on glass. Your key is you want that flat surface. So for any blade, I've mentioned just now, we want these two surfaces to come together and to be in a perfectly straight line, so we can get a nice sharp edge to that blade. And so the very first thing to do is to make the easy part of it, the back perfectly flat. This is, I think we'll switch to a close-up for what I'm going to talk about now. Okay, so this chisel is one I bought a set, I think, way back when I first even thought about the possibility of maybe in the future I'll do some woodworking. I bought three tools three chisels from Ace Hardware, and that's probably 20 years ago. You'll notice that the handle on this is plastic with metal on it. That's because it's designed basically for using with a mallet or a hammer. The more heavy-duty chisels that you use in either heavier woodwork or in the joinery that you use for houses and moldings and so on, you very often end up using a hammer with it. I try to avoid using a hammer, but I have to say there are times when it really saves you a lot of sweat. But anyway, this is what's known as I think it's a firmer chisel. It has beveled sides and beveled edges, which are really nice for getting down into dovetails, although you need a thinner blade than this for most dovetails. But for getting into dovetails and for getting into nice tight, into little 90-degree corners there. So you want your edges to be nice and squared off as well. So the first thing we do before we do anything else is we take our old chisel and just flatten the back. And what we're going to do is flatten the back, starting with sandpaper, and then work our way up through the grits until we have somewhat, it doesn't have to be perfectly polished, but a nice flat back with a good polish, at least close to the edge. And one reason for that is that, for example, you're cutting a mortise and you're going down, you want this back edge to be really, really flat. That way you won't, the blade won't, as you go down, it won't get pushed, oops, that way, pushed out to the side. You'll get a perfectly straight, wall to that mortise. So we always want, and with a chisel, we need it to be 2-3 inches at least, whatever, because you want it to go to, to bear, basically to register on the wood with this really nice flat surface. So this is our first task, is to make a nice flat surface. So we can use the sandpaper. I'm going to start here with 220. I'm going to put it like this because it'll be a little easier to work. I'm going to give it a little splash of water. Don't need too much, but just enough to lubricate it. And as you can see, I've already worked this a little bit. I was wanting to show you a completely dirty back there, but I did it with a couple of strokes without thinking. So the other big and very useful when making these, when getting the backs flat and getting our bevels flat, is the permanent marker. So I'm going to mark a grid pattern on this here. I can already see, because I've been doing it for a while, I can see there's a nice shiny metal area there, and then there's a dirty area. And that dirty area is a hollow, which will get borne out by my first few strokes here. Got to be careful that I don't cut myself with the edge of this glass, but I still want to get my chisel on there. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but I'm just going to go back and forth here. And you can see that, or it's a pretty flat already because it's taken off all of the permanent marker. So I think if I work this for just another minute or so, we're probably going to have pretty close to a perfectly flat back. But believe me, sometimes I'll work a plane for an hour with this. This is where using the Tormac is really nice to save you a little bit of time. The other disadvantage with sandpaper is it's already beginning to come up. I think you can see there. And when that happens, if you catch a sharp edge in the paper, then you ruin your sandpaper. So it's got, it's got its pros and cons. But all I'm doing is putting a nice steady pressure, downward pressure on this and running it back and forth. And you can see that it's beginning to disappear. So you guys, now is the sort of time when any questions you've got would be easy to answer, because I'm just going to work this for a minute or two. All right.
Paul, I see that you're basically only using one side of that piece of sandpaper. Do you rotate it, or do you sometimes use a narrower piece?
I can't get it flat because I need to, my handle is deeper than the glass, so I need to be at the edge here. So if I were holding this down with just water tension, after a little while I'd flip it round. But it's not going to take long to wear this paper out anyway. But yes, if this were a stone, if this were like a 250 stone or a 120 stone, something like that, then I would be using both sides, or even the full width of it. We're getting there. It's not going to take too long. I thought it would take longer. Not a very good piece of sandpaper. It's already been used a little bit. Is it?
What's the value of using glass as a background instead of a piece of wood?
You can get a perfectly flat piece of glass. Wood moves all the time, so although it can be close to flat, for this purpose you want flat. Okay, still got a little ways to go. It's deceiving sometimes. At first you look like you're pretty close, but because that little hollow, the further you go down into it, the more metal you have to remove in order to get a little further down. So it actually gets a little harder, not easy. And I may have to switch to the other one I've got over there in order to complete this, because this is beginning, this sandpaper is beginning to wear. See, that black stuff is all the steel that's coming off. Are we getting close? I may compromise and stop a little short just in the interests of not boring you and keeping the time, keeping things going here, but we'll at least have a usable chisel at the end. And I want to show you what you're aiming for. I found that when I started trying to sharpen chisels, first of all, I didn't know what sharp really was, which didn't help. And I just didn't understand what I was shooting for. I didn't understand that I was shooting for that one single line. I understood it in principle, but I didn't, understand it. And once I got that, you don't settle for anything less. I'm getting pretty close here. So, rag. This is another vital tool when you're sharpening, is a rag. We will, you see, we've got a nice polished area, or not polished, but ground area here, nice ground area here, a little bit of a hollow in here. It's pretty close. So I wouldn't feel the need to put the permanent marker on the whole chisel. but just near where I'm getting close there. This also is a short chisel. Most of my chisels would, I'd be able to get further into the sandpaper with them because they're a little longer. There are advantages and disadvantages to short and long chisels, so it's nice to have both if you've got it. Okay, getting close. I've certainly got enough to work with here. And for the sake of, when I get home, I'll finish up polishing the back. But for the sake of moving on, I turn it round. So that was 220. So now I'm going to go up to 320 and just give it a little bit of a, not much, because I've done most of the hard work. So now all I'm doing really is just working up through here to make that scratch pattern a little smoother. This also is coming up, so as you work it, you have to be careful. The best way to glue these down is that spray-on glue. I just happen to use Gorilla because it's what I bought last, but you know, you spray it on both surfaces, leave it for a minute till it gets tacky, and then you put it down, and it's glued down nicely, but it's not a permanent glue down. All right, looking good. So that's come up just a little bit more shiny. So now I'm gonna flip it over. That was 320 grit. And these are all just stuff you got lying around in your shop. You know, as you know, once you get to 400 and beyond, it's hard to actually get anything but wet and dry paper.
When you're at a swap meet, Paul, what are you looking for? What chisels do you reject immediately, and what do you look for to select one?
Well, it depends. When you first start, try and think of it in terms of someone who's just beginning. What I'll look for is that it's never been bent, that it doesn't look as if it's been abused too much. I don't worry too much about the edge because I'm going to work that. If there's any change of color in the metal, it means it's probably been heated. If the tip is blue, it means you're going to have to grind that off because chisel steel is tempered, and when you heat it, whether it's on a grinder by over grinding or by using a blowtorch or whatever, then you detemper it and it becomes soft and not usable as a tool. So I'd look out for things to be straight. I look for the best possible condition, but if it was something really funky, you know, it's unusual or rare in terms of size or whatever, then. But and these days I look for something that hasn't been used much, you know, something that looks reasonably new. What I tend to do is I like the socket chisels because this is a socket and tang chisel, but basically with this, there's a piece of metal going up into it, which you can actually see if you look closely. And the handle comes down over it. And that's how it works with the wooden handle as well. But the socket ones, the handle sockets into them, which means that you can hit them harder and you don't split out the wood. And they have a few other advantages as well that are kind of nice to use. But because the handles are just whacked in there, then if you leave it for 6 months, it may fall out when you come back to it. But, I think condition, as much as possible. I think my experience is you look through those boxes that have really crappy looking rusty tools, and you don't want too much rust on a chisel blade. You know, a little rust on a plane is okay, but when you're looking to get a nice flat back, like, I'm sorry. What happened?
Just while you're talking.
Oh, right. Oh, just was. Oh, I see. We're just switching back and forth. So once you've got a nice flat back, or when you go for the nice flat back, if you've got pits in there, then then that doesn't give you the flat back end, especially if you have pits on the top here or through the metal, because then you'll never get that blade. So condition is probably the biggest thing. And I wouldn't spend too much time looking for cheap chisels unless you want to go and buy old chisels, which tend to have, you know, I don't know, there's something about them. If you want to buy old ones and restore them. But, you know, even Stanley make a really nice set of chisels. Okay, so I'm at 400. I'm going to flip it around and go up to 600. And then we're going to say goodbye to the sandpaper for the moment.
Paul, do you care about what kind of steel it is specifically?
It's hard to tell when you're at the swap meet. Yes, I do care. The better the quality of steel, the better the job it does for you. But the whole steel thing is there's the question of hardness against brittleness and different alloys and stuff like that. The only way that I've found by used tools you can tell is take it home, fix it up, and use it. And what tends to denote the lower quality steels is that it's either hard to get a really good edge, although you usually can get an edge, and hard to keep that edge. The really nice steel, you know, steels that say Veritas and Lee Nielsen use are really purpose-made alloys to get that absolute perfect compromise between brittleness and strength. But again, you know, you might find something that's really soft, but you like using it, so you don't mind sharpening it. And I'll make reference to this, but I'm always using my honing leather. It's just I have it on the bench, and it really helps to keep that blade sharp. And the advantage of keeping that blade sharp is you don't have to sharpen it very often. All right, so I've got a nice. Could we switch to the close up? Sorry. So I've got a nice. Let me wipe that off. Nice flat surface there. So I'm going to set aside, going up through the grit still, because I want an actual polish. I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to bring in the diamond plate. Okay, so up to now we've gone up to about 600 grit. So I'm not going to use the 600 grit diamond plate. I'm going to go straight to the 1200. And again, I'm going to put it on the edge here. There we go. And we have diamond plates in the shop. They're in these nice wooden boxes, and they look a little different from this one, but they work. They're very good. That's what we keep our tools sharp here with. So again, with the diamond plate, the advantages of a diamond plate are that they tend to stay flat, and they tend to they stay flat so they don't belly out, which is always really nice, and they're fairly aggressive, but they are a little pricey. This one I think is about $70 at Rockler, and it has a 600 and a 1200 grit on it. Once you get up to about 1200 grit with a decent quality steel, you begin to see what looks like a polish. You're beginning to get to a grit where it's beginning to shine rather than just show marks. So that's the 1200. So do that a little bit more. And you could see just then that little bellied area, that little part that I didn't flatten out, doesn't get any flatter, doesn't disappear. It's still there, but it's still a pretty flat chisel. Okay, so that's my diamond plate. Didn't need to do a lot with that. So now I'm going to move on to the waterstones. Again, it's really important to have these be very flat. is I can work with my fingers on the bench here. So I actually used the opportunity yesterday to flatten these guys out. This one I haven't flattened since I bought it. It's 8,000 grit, and that is where I usually stop. I don't have anything that's finer than that except diamond paste, and but I find that 8,000 grit gives me the sharpness that I want. This is a 4,000 grit, which we're going to use next. So it's not as fine as the 8,000, but it will start getting a nice polish on the back of the blades. So away we go.
Sorry for the dumb question, Paul, but if you're just starting out, how do you advise someone to tell whether a chisel is sharp?
I'll show you when we got this sharp. Once you understand that's a great question. I will demo how I can know that this chisel is really sharp at the end of it.
What if you don't have hair on your arms?
We won't be using hair on our arms. Well, I might just for the dramatic value, but no, I'll
You can do the hair on your face.
the best way is to test it with a piece of wood, and that's what we'll do. I will test it across the grain, across end grain rather.
Perfect, thanks.
That way, because the whole purpose of having a sharp blade is to be able to cut the fibers. If you're cutting across end grain, then that's fine. This is fine. If you're cutting across end grain, then you really need a very sharp blade, because if you can imagine trying to cut like across that bundle of straws that you saw in a woodwork class at one point, a blunt blade or a dull blade would just push the straw before it cuts it and distort it. If you can cut that fiber without moving it across end grain, then it gives you a lovely, lovely smooth finish that you just can't even get with sandpaper. All right, I'm going to keep on down here. Wow, that thing switches quick, doesn't it? That's really smart, cute. And I'm going to use everything that we've just used shortly to actually get the bevel in good shape. It's important as you go up through the grits here, keep an eye on the back of your blade itself, because each one is inevitably going to be ever so slightly different. So you don't get like a perfect mirror finish. You might get some little, differences in the texture there. Don't worry about that too much, as long as it's really nice and smooth. But sometimes you'll find that as you flatten with the coarser grits, you then find that you're getting something coming up that looks a little different. And that's when it's really good to have confidence in the fact that what you're working with is flat. And even not so much in the 4,000 and the 8,000 grit range, but even in once you get down into the 1,000 grit, those things that you can watch them bellying out as you work. So you have to work the stones so that you minimize that, and you have to flatten them frequently. And of course that wears the stones out. And like this stone is, I think it's about 80, 90 bucks for this guy. So you really want to treat them with respect, and I try to use them sparingly, but I'll talk about how I avoid using these. I always use the water stones when I'm sharpening, when I'm actually, preparing a tuning something up, should we say, just because there's a little bit something about them. But when I'm actually on the bench, I use a ceramic stone. But again, you can use any combination of these or just one of them. You can use just water stones. You can use just sandpaper. All right, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but you can see there's some slight differences in texture there where I've been rubbing it, but we're getting a really nice polish up near the front here. So I'm going to work this just for about another minute so that at least I've got full width of that polish, and then we'll move on to the 8,000. But most of my chisels, or most chisels, should be you know, somewhere between 1 inch and 2 to 3 inches, depending on the length of the chisel and what you're going to use it for in terms of the polish. With a plane, that's different. You can go really close to the edge because the plane blade is usually going to get slightly distorted or slightly changed in shape as we go through that. So this flattening the back is tedious. It can be quite time consuming on some blades, but it's worth it because you only have to do this once. Getting a bit dry there, but I'm getting something close to a polish. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it did look, isn't it? So now we move to the 8000, which again, I just flattened out yesterday. And, you know, if I had I can use the whole of this. I will actually try to, because I don't want to take it out of level. So I try to use the whole length of the stone. Occasionally I'll just go to the ends and work a little there just because the middle tends to get worn out more quickly. The finer water stones don't need to be pre-soaked. If you're using something like 1000 grit, you have to pre-soak it for about 15 minutes or so. Another point is as you go up from one grit to the next, try not to transfer the particles. So, because part of your stone is coming off here, so you don't want a piece of 1000 grit stuff on an 8000 grit stone. It'll dig a hole in the stone and it'll leave a little scratch on the back of your. That's not in the way there, is it? No, that's great. It's going dry under my blade because it's sufficiently flat that it's basically squeezing all the water out. And again, that mixture of black there, that black stuff is a mixture of the steel from the blade and the grit from the stone itself.
There's no harm in pre-soaking the 4000 or 8000 grit water stones, is there?
I don't think there's any harm in pre-soaking it, but you wouldn't want to keep it soaked because it might go soft. It's a bit like the Tormek wheel. You don't want to keep it in water because it goes a little softer there. But and really with the 4000 and 8000, the critical factor is that the water stays on the surface. If you put water on it and it just soaks away back to what it looked like before, but wetter, then you need to soak it. But if you spray it on and maybe one lot soaks in, but then the next lot doesn't, then you don't need to soak it. So up at 8000, I'd rather just keep my stone in good shape. Just finish this up a little bit, and then we're going to move on to the interesting bit. It's flattening the back that in the hand tool joinery class and other classes, this is what gets people really, this is so miserable. You just work and work at it, but getting that really nice flat back is important. You see, this one is in pretty fair shape. Not perfect, but again, it's got a nice clean back there, which really helps with your work. Okay, so we've got a fairly well polished back, and we're now going to move on to doing this using a jig. So yeah, let's take away the close-up for a minute, and I'll talk about the jigs. Okay, so there's a number of jigs available on the market that I'm gonna have to do something. I'm gonna have to wear a hat or something during these presentations. My hair gets a little wild. This is one from the shop. This is the most basic. You can buy them at Harbor Freight, just a mile up the road here. I wouldn't counsel you to do that. I'd buy a better quality. But this basically, in the case of this one, will hold your blade like this. I'm putting this blade to the metal, but remember, it's not a sharp blade at this point. So just to illustrate, it holds. But these basic ones have a couple of disadvantages. They don't hold it very well because there's a taper on the edge of this. So at the back, it doesn't really fit very well. So these will do the trick though. And they have, what's important is they have the distance or the amount your blade needs to stick out marked. Oh yeah, should we go back to the close-up? They have the amount your blade needs to stick out marked on the side here, so you can never forget it. It's in millimeters, so you need a millimeter rule. But basically, if it says it's, I haven't got a rule here, but if it says it's, I'll use a square as a pretend rule. If it says it's 30 millimeters, I measure 30 millimeters from the edge of the blade to here, to this edge here, and that gives me the right angle for the blade. That's necessary. You have to set that angle whatever jig you're using. So the next jig I want to show you, so that is pretty common. You can buy that all over the place, probably even buy one in Home Depot. But this I think is a better quality than some. Certainly it's better than the old one I have at home. Then you move on to something like this, which is made by Veritas, has a wheel on the bottom. That's what rolls on the stone itself. Oh, let me just get a stone to show you. So that rolls on there. I set my chisel again. First of all, I have to set it the right way around. And remember that the chisel has to go bevel down, so not bevel up. I set my chisel, and then I can check the square by a rather sort of arcane process of, sorry, I'm trying to orient it. There you go. Of using my square against this edge here. These little squares seem to be the only squares I've got that will work with it. But once I've set it, it has a couple of disadvantages, in so much as this is you turn it, and that tends to have do you see the blade moving there? However hard you turn it, it doesn't hold the blade that well. So even when it's squared away and you start working, you have to keep checking it frequently. But this is what I've used for years and if you use it carefully, it'll work really well. It has the ability to adjust for micro bevel, about which we'll talk later, and for a back bevel. But it's still fairly basic, and you have to be pretty careful about keeping your tool square and lined up. And then Veritas came up with this design a few years ago. Some of you have seen it before. This is the Mark II honing guide. Sufficiently good quality that it's worth throwing up worth having you guys have a look at that box. It's the Veritas Mark II honing guide. And it's my belief that if you want a hand sharpening jig, this is probably the last one you need to buy. It's got a couple of big advantages. It sets the square for you, and it sets the angle. And if we go back to the close-up camera, I will show you how we do that. Okay, so very first thing that we need to do is to establish what angle our current chisel has. So what we do is we use, this is one of a number of possibilities, but they all work on very similar principle. You stick that little V-shaped slot in there, and each one is marked with the degrees. And when it's a good fit to your chisel, which in this case is going to be 30 degrees, you hold it up to the light, and usually they won't be absolutely perfect to the angle that you've got, but you can get pretty close. And then you can change it if you need to by eyeball. But you basically, to establish the angle of almost any beveled edge, you just keep going with one of these. They don't cost a lot, easy to lose, so make sure you have a good place for it. but they give you an idea of the blade angle. On this, it's 30 degrees. So we're going to go with the 30 degrees, and once I put this in here and set it up at 30 degrees, I'll then check it to be sure that it really is flat on the, you know, that it's lined up. But we'll get to that in a minute. So the very first thing I'm going to do, is that visible? Yeah, you guys can see that. I'm going to set the degrees. It's got a rather confusing set of different colors there. In this case, we are looking for the yellow, right, which is the middle of 3 settings on this, which I'll talk about again a bit later. And it has, what's nice about this is for the specific angles, like 30 degrees, it actually has a little notch that this screws into. So you can now go back to exactly 30 degrees. You don't have to mess around measuring 30 millimeters or whatever. You can go back to that with the same piece at a future date and cut it to the same angle. So that's the first aspect of this. The other aspect is that you can, oh, here. Now what it is basically when we set this up in the machine, the chisel will go that far in. So what we do is we attach this. It's sort of not exactly a fence, it's a guide. We put this on the edge of the piece and we choose where we're going to do it. I always try to place my piece in the middle if possible. We secure that down. So now this is nice and solid on the fence. It's not 100% solid, but it doesn't have to be. I can flip it over. And the way we hold the chisel here is by this bar, which has two knurled knobs, and because they're not having a tendency to turn the piece, it's easier to keep it square. So I'm going to basically feed this in through here. So I got my bevel down, because ultimately once I'm there, we'll be able to turn it over and we'll be ready to start grinding. Okay, so my chisel is not quite in there far enough. Nice and square. Now it's in far enough. There's always a slight variation in the, in everything that you do by hand. But this machine really helps take the guesswork out of it. So now I've got my piece secure. Now I can take this off because I'm done with it. And I can set that aside. A little drink of water. You can listen to my thing crinkling. All right. So now I've got this thing set up for cutting this bevel at 30 degrees. So let's see if it looks like it's even going to do it. That looks absolutely spot on to me. What you do is you get down by the side of it and hold it up to the light if you need to. I'm sorry. And check from the side. There you go, to see that it's flat on there, because otherwise you're going to spend some time grinding away metal that you don't need to. The whole question of angles, basically the steeper the angle, the stronger the, I'm going to do a little surgeon thing here. The steeper the angle, the stronger the resistance to chipping or to dulling. However, the steeper the angle, the harder it is to cut. So setting the angle of your different chisels for different purposes can be something that you have to learn about. Some people obsess with it, some people don't. I tend to go with the angle I find, unless it's really funky. If I buy a chisel and it's at 45 degrees, first I'm going to go, why is it at 45 degrees? And then I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to switch that to 25, which is a good normal medium for plane blades and chisel blades. So 25 degrees is like middle of the road. And then I'll show you a little trick to do with that as well. Now, I trust this thing, but where did I put my little square? There. I can't tell you the times I spent looking for things that are under rags in my shop. So I'm going to actually, with this, I'm going to check the square here against, making sure that I'm actually against the part that really is flat. So I can see that that's pretty darn good. That has set it as good as I could possibly set it with the square. So I know now that as I grind, I should get it nice and square across the front. And while I'm at it, when you first look at a chisel, you do want to put a square across it and see see that it is reasonably close to square. And if it's not, then you work with it. So that's something else. If you look at a chisel that's really off, that's really off in terms of it's skewed. It might either be a skew chisel, or it might be that just somebody has over time sharpened it over to a skew. Are we working? Cool. Okay, so let's move back to the close-up. And I'm, rather than starting with the sandpaper, I'm going to just see how things go for me with the 600 grit diamond, because I don't have a very big area of metal here. So if I spend an extra half minute on the 600 that I wouldn't have to spend on 200, then that's okay with me. So I'm going to just, how you pattern this doesn't matter, but I'm going to just put a little opponent marker on there. I'm going to just do a couple of strokes. Now, this is a very heavy-handled chisel, so I want to make sure that I hold this jig nicely, because it'll have that tendency to knock back like that. And just, I'm learning, and this is, something I keep having to relearn, is to try not to touch the actual tool as I work it, so that I don't move it. Because even this method of holding it is not 100%. It's not like you've just been able to put 90 pounds pressure on a vise and hold it steady. So I'm going to just run it back and forth once. And you can see, once I get it into your picture, that already it's taken a little bit off the front end there. Okay, I'm happy with that. It's pretty darn close. I'm going to grind it for a minute and see what happens. As long as this is in a jig and I'm not doing my final actual getting it sharp and making it super sharp, then I can run it back and forth. But once I start to get to where I really fine tune that edge, I'll be pulling it away always, because it's so easy to tip this over and round off that nice edge. So
is the grinding happening on both directions of the action? Like, is it like a pull saw?
Yes. It's more like running it over a piece of sandpaper.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's happening in both directions, yes. Again, I move the piece around on the diamond plate just because even diamonds wear out. And eventually this will wear out, so I want to wear as evenly as possible. Okay, interestingly, you can see that it's cutting kind of across the blade, so that blade may be a little out of square, or I may be a little out of square here. So I've got to keep an eye on it. Excuse me, I'm a little thinking time here. It's always pays off. Let's just grind that for a moment. It was, it's grinding right in the middle of that allegedly flat bevel, which is good, but it's doing it at a funny little angle. Okay, you know, I'm gonna have to. This is something you come across. This, it doesn't always get set up perfectly the first time. I forgot to actually double check my square before I put it in there. It's pretty square. I had to hold it up to the light there. That's pretty square. So that's telling me that something in the jig is not set right. Probably the way I set it up. So I'm going to start using the guide again. Put the guide in. Firmly in place. We're set for 30 degrees. All right. Now I'm going to double check my square. That looks to be square. Everything's square. So let's keep grinding. I have to trust my setup. One of the things about when you're grinding these, sometimes you get some very deceptive looking things. You know, like this is at a slight angle across here. I would have hoped that the perfectly square cut would have come out square to this edge here. But this is not a very high quality blade, so it may be cut slightly out. The only thing that concerns me is that we end up with a square edge at the end. So we're just going to grind that for a minute and see. I may have to go back. In fact, I will go back to the sandpaper just to speed things up. Which is my 220. Always on the back. Wow, it's already 11 o'clock. I may have to complete this next time. Let's see. Now you see this sandpaper is too, that's the 320. That's too loose to be able to work with this. See the way it caught on the paper there? That's giving me a better. I'm going to trust my guide. Always a challenge trying to get something like this, which is an open-ended effort, into a fixed time, and I'm running kind of behind. I think I can still get us done by 11:15. Yeah, you begin to see some of the disadvantages of sandpaper. This sheet is just about short. Another one here. Fresh paper on it. All right. We'll even go without, we'll try it without This is 220 without water, because I don't want to lube it up and get it sliding again. All right, I'm almost to the edge there. As soon as I get it ground all the way to the edge, I'm going to move on to another. You see, I'm beginning to get little pieces of iron filing on the edge there. That's telling me that because it's dry, that's why this is happening. But you're only going to get that kind of the electrostatic effect that holds those iron filings on the tip when you're pretty close to an edge anyway, because it, you know, the electricity has to go out through a sharp point. So we're pretty darn close. All right, so now you can see that the iron filings are all the way across there, and I can take those off. So I'm going to just very quickly work my way up through the grits. Well, dry, largely. 400, then 600. I'm not showing you each time because of the time factor, but normally I would be examining this each time. Okay, you can see we're beginning to get a nice clean face there. So we will now move on to the diamond plates. And again, we're not going to have to spend too much time on them because we've done the heavy work of getting that flat edge. Keeping nice finger pressure on here is important because it's still very easy to rock. And if you rock in even a small way, it gives you a blade that's not. Okay, that's looking nice. Move on to 1200. Obviously, if I press so hard that it goes up like that, that's going to damage the edge there. Now, you can't see it because it's so small, but there is now I can never forget the name. It's a pencil file or whatever. It's a tiny little tube of steel that's come off of the bevel here as we are grinding it, and I can feel it by running my finger along the back there, and I can feel a rough edge all along there. That's good because that means I've reached the edge of the bevel here. So now these two surfaces are meeting reasonably close.
That's called the burr.
Yes?
That's called the burr.
It's called a burr, a pencil burr. That's right. Yeah, as in Aaron Burr. So anyway, okay, so I got my pencil burr, which is nice, and tells me when I can feel it all the way across, it tells me I now have an edge. It may not be a perfectly sharp edge, but I now have an edge that's all the way across, and we will take that off. But we don't want to take it off by flipping it over and doing it on here, because this is a polished back. So we only want to take this off with the 8000 grit. So we're now at the 1200 grit. And we're going to move on now to the 4000 grit. Again, really important. And if you're really persnickety, by the way, you should clean this roller in between grits as well, because your roller will transfer bits of grit. Okay, so now I'm going to run it back and forth on my nice flat 4000 grit piece. And you can see something akin to a polish that's coming up. 4000 was the first grit that when I bought Waterstones, when I saw the polish on that, and I was like, holy, you know what? This is what goes on. So it's not perfect. I haven't got right perfectly to the edge, right? But for the interest of time, hour and a quarter to transfer a tool that was unusable into a nice tool. It's not really a long time. All right, so I've got a nice polish on there now. I'd probably, by the way, do more grinding than is strictly required. When I've watched people from Lee Nielsen do it, they seem to do it in a few strokes, or a few passes, as they call it. Okay, so now we're up to the 8000 grit, and we're actually creating a final polish on the bevel.
Paul, if you were to grind the bevel to make a hollow bevel with the Tormek, would the other steps that you're showing us be exactly the same?
Yes, with the difference that I'm using this jig for this. Once I'm done with the Tormek, I'd then be working this by hand, which I'm going to do in just a minute. But
just, the hollow bevel just allows you to feel the angle more correctly.
Yes, right. Which, you know, is a nice advantage. But we'll talk about that in just a minute. I've got a little add-on to that. So now I've got a pretty nice polish. It's not perfect, but a pretty nice polish on that front edge there. And I can feel that burr heavily. I can't take that off yet. So, and I'm done with grinding the thing. So I'm going to take it out of the jig, and we'll do the rest of it by hand. So I can do the same thing as we just did with that one with the hollow grind. I can feel my way to where it's flat on the piece, on the stone, and I can do my any final work that I need to just by feeling that edge there. First thing I'm going to do is take off that burr, and the way to do that is to run it backwards along your 8000 grit, the grit at which you polished it. And now, did it actually come? Yes, part of it came off right there. But normally you would feel that, that burr now on the bevel side, and you would turn it over, get it to your edge there, pull it back, check that there isn't a bevel on that side. A burr. Once you can't feel the burr anymore, never put your finger that way to the blade, always away. Once you feel that burr, then feel it gone, then you've already got a blade. So, oh wait, that's right, here, we'll use this. Okay, so I can see if I've actually got something that cuts just by testing it with a piece of wood. Across the grain. Okay, so that's cutting reasonably nicely. Now, there are still some minor imperfections in the way I put this together, right? Because I don't tend to be completely OCD. So, there's a technique to use that enables you to sharpen your blades very quickly and to keep them sharp very, very easily. So we've got a bevel, we've got our two polished edges coming to a nice edge. It actually cuts wood, we know that. So now, and it's at 30 degrees, but there's a little technique that you can use that makes sharpening or sharpening as you go a lot easier, and it also increases the time that you have between sharpening, because basically we're going to shallow up the angle of the, or rather steepen up the angle of the leading edge of the blade. And the way to do that, we ground this at 30 degrees, I decided that the way to do this was to cut a piece of wood at 37 degrees and put it alongside my stone. So I can put it alongside whatever I'm gonna do what I'm about to do. And I'm basically going to put what's called a micro bevel on this front edge here. So I'm gonna go back to my 1200 diamond stone. So I don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. I'm gonna go to my 1200 diamond. I'm gonna place that. Can I make it easier for you to see? Yes. I place that on there as my guide. Then I'm gonna set my blade at about that angle. I don't need this now because I've taught myself the muscle memory. It's the angle of this and then a little more. It's up to 37 degrees, which is a good angle. But as I say, I've taught myself the muscle memory. I'm gonna just draw this back 2 or 3 times. At that angle. I've never seen any jigs sort of offering. Now, offering something like this was just something I thought would help me. I've got a burr again on the edge there, right? So I don't want to take it off with this, but you can also, can you see that? Yes, you can see that line of light there really nicely. That's the only part that actually needs to be sharp. So I'm going to go up through the grits here, but as that goes dull and I'm working it, all I have to do is take it 37 degrees, draw it back a couple of times, and I would normally do it on a 4 or 8,000 if it was while I was working. I did this because I'm creating it on the 1200. So now what I want to do is take that burr off on the 8,000 and very quickly take the 4,000 here and the 8,000. Take it up to my 37 degrees. This was such a help for me to just learn to actually set my body at 37 degrees. All right, so now that little edge has a bit of a polish on it. You see the way the water's soaking into that stone? So if you've got something like 1,000 grit, it just soaks away. If you spray it on like that, it would be gone by the time I put the sprayer down. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing, my 37 degrees. And if I need the whole thing, I can always lay it on a piece of wood next to it. 2, 3, let's put a polish on it. Okay, and then I'm going to feel for that burr. Looks like the burr came off, but I'm going to just double check by running it a couple of times. Okay, and I will demonstrate with wood in a moment, but let us see. What I want to do is one last thing. If you keep a leather strop with a little grinding stropping compound on there, on your bench, you can get this even really nice and sharp. And in normal work, if you do this every few minutes, you don't really need to go back to the stones for a while. You can just keep honing it. Because all you're doing when you go to the stones is taking metal out. So if you don't need to take metal out, don't. And then, let's see. Yep, that's just beautifully cutting hair there. Do you guys see that? Do we have anyone here? All right, so finally, the way to test it, I don't have a proper vise here. You set up a piece of end grain wood in the vise. And I can, let's see, can we get a better angle on that for you. Is that still clear? You can see I'm just cutting a very thin slice there. And then if I look at my edge here, so that's sharp enough for me. Now this isn't a very high quality blade. This isn't, as I say, it's not high quality, but it may be a little softer than the better qualities, but if I keep honing it with the strop, it'll stay just as sharp. It'll dull down a little sooner, that's all. But other than that, that's how you sharpen a chisel. Any questions? Has everybody left?
That was great, Paul. I really appreciate it.
No, that's really helped me out.
Oh, good. Well, contact me if you guys want some more help. Boy, it's amazing how just doing a little sharpening will work up a sweat. My wife says I never work out.
Very good.
Yeah, so I know that I'm going to be getting together with at least one of our members to do some plane restoring and so on. And Lewis is joining us as a hand tool person, you know, with the helping to maintain the tools and so on. So we're going to work together on that. But I thought that, you know, I'd try and come up with a series like this where we just work our way up through the basics of sharpening and do this every two or three times. Other than that, I'm already way over time. So any other comments from you guys?
That Veritas Mark II is about $70 or $75, I think, is on Amazon or at Lehigh.
Yeah. However, if you're trying to save a buck, I just bought one for $50. Online, I've found that if you go to eBay and you sort by only using the accept offer section, I got my hair go crazy. If you just go to accept and look at the ads that accept offers, very often if you offer less than their lowest bidding price, you'll get it. I got a Mark II for $50 with the mail, with the shipping included. So
that's a very good price.
I got one. Plus, Veritas are way behind on their manufacturing. I think the COVID thing has really hit them hard. Some of their tools aren't going to be available till January.
Yeah. Good to know.
Hey, Paul, do you have any plans to do a demonstration with the Tormac?
Didn't I do one just recently?
No, right at the beginning of the series, but we've done some work with that, and I think we've got a different audience right now.
Oh yes, certainly. We can make the next one about the Tormac again, if you like. Oh.
Well, I'd be glad for that. It's a tool that I'd like to know how to use.
Okay, we'll do it again. Yeah, I don't mind repeating anything because after all, this is the whole objective here is to help out and to get people up to speed rather than go, oh, you don't know how to do it, you know. So yes, absolutely. Let's think about that. Yeah, we had a problem with the shop Tormac, and I went off on out in the weeds my diagnosis on it, but the two of us got together. Rick got together with me, and we solved the problem. So our Tormac is old but still working and works beautifully. So come on in and use it. Just remember to true it up every time you use it, and we'll show you how.
That'd be a good idea to show us how to true it up, because that's the biggest challenge with it. Getting it set up right.
It really is. But once your actual equipment is in good shape, it's actually pretty easy. But it really does help to have the thing working properly.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks again. Have a great rest of your weekend.
All right, thanks.
Oh, thank you guys for checking in.
Thank you very much. It's really good.